streamers metric is all
I think they made that movie for like.
What you brought up was exactly.
But will this mean at a certain point?
So with all
When you guys are perfectly team.
Okay, so the studio system, again, a brief history lesson that is going to last a few slides, so maybe not as brief as I thought it would be, but alas, let's get into it. So on a basic level, when somebody sort of refers to the studio system, what they're referring to is a really small group of studios. These are usually called major studios that controlled a majority of production and distribution of film, and as a result had a greater command over box office profits. And obviously that was in a time when there were fewer people, fewer businesses, all kinds of things. And that's usually looking back at the golden age of Hollywood, which was again this period in sort of the early to mid 20th century, the 1920s to roughly the 1960s, where there was just this huge boom in American cinema, huge technological advances. The world was changing in a major way. Obviously there was the Second World War kind of falls into this as well, and that's really important. So I think really when people say the studio system, they're kind of referring to the past. Today, when we're referring to the studio system, in fact, I don't think many people would usually say the studio system, but it's really ultimately a loose term to describe sort of the major and mini major studios that are prominent buyers in today's market. But again, it's not like it's a term that you must use, and it's incorrect if you don't use it in today's world. But again, just something to know because studios still exist. They're still relatively powerful. So this is just like a quick overview of what the majors were during the golden age. I wanted to put up their logos because in a way, I'll show you some logos of today's present sort of majors and mini majors. And it's so interesting just from a visual perspective to see what has changed or who has kind of kept their logo. For example, Paramount more or less looks the same. MGM still has that incredible lion in the center. Warner Brothers, of course, has also kept its sort of basic logo. Universal has the same idea, but it's changed up a little bit. Columbia Pictures too, you can see that. Fox Film Corporation will eventually become 20th Century Fox, and now today is actually 20th Century Studios since it's been acquired by Disney. And then we have a couple others here, RKO Pictures and United Artists, which don't really exist today. Actually, United Artists might exist on a very minor level as part of like a distribution company, but it's kind of not in the picture anymore. But yeah, there you have it. These were the 8 majors that were kind of ruling Hollywood. Maybe sort of a notable missing name here is, Disney. Disney was kind of coming up towards the end of kind of this decline in the studio system, but obviously you'll see in today's present day, Disney's really, really powerful. So there you go. Shows you time changes everything. So there's so much to cover in terms of how studios worked sort of back in the 20s up into the 60s. I wanted to just touch on a couple of practices that don't necessarily feel unusual, especially when we talk about present day. What you'll actually find is that there's a fair amount of overlap, but maybe a couple things that just could be interesting to highlight. Again, one is just because there were less films being made, more, just a few amount of studios sort of controlling all those films were being made. A lot of studios engage in the practice of sending out sort of exclusive talent contracts. So a major studio would begin implementing short-term, which could be a few months, long-term, which could be, a year, 2 years, and they could be renewed depending on how that deal plays out. But basically you can have exclusive contracts with talent, and that means both above and below the line. And what I mean by that is actors could have exclusive contracts, directors and producers could have exclusive contracts, definitely writers, but also, production designers, costume designers, makeup department heads, cinematographers. It was helpful to studios in the sense that they could make movies more consistently because it's not like their talent were saying after one movie, okay, we have to go make a movie in a different studio. They were exclusive to their studio. So it was very easy for studios to say, great, you've worked on this movie. Now we've got this movie coming up and we need you to go in it. And you were more or less obligated. Especially if you weren't probably an actor, you were definitely obligated to just go where you were pointed towards. Actors probably had a bit more wiggle room, but probably not a lot either. It definitely depends on what's written in the contract. And as a result, studios could sort of, I don't want to say they actually did this, but they could basically attempt to maintain a certain consistency in their revenue stream. Again, the more movies you put out, and we'll talk about this, and if you can, we're going to talk about this in a second, but basically the more movies that you can put out, if you can guarantee distribution and exhibition of those movies, you're going to have some kind of revenue stream come in, especially because there just wasn't a lot of other leisure options at this time. So lots of people were going to the movies. It was a huge experience. It was a treat to go to a theater. All that good stuff. And if you had, especially actors, certain actors under exclusive contracts, and you knew that you could constantly put them in movies and people were excited about those actors, you were guaranteed, to an extent, some kind of profit at the end of the day, because you were putting out movies with those actors that people constantly wanted to return to the movie theaters to go see. It also gave studios the ability to shape up and coming talent. So they would have casting directors that would basically go find up and comers who of course weren't as famous, but had a lot of potential, have them sign most likely short-term exclusive deal contracts, and then put them through acting lessons, put them through dance lessons, put them through singing lessons, giving them the resources to become the next generation of actors that could really help them sell a lot of tickets and make a lot of movies. But there's also something to be said about studios actually providing resources to give actors the things they need to succeed in their roles. You definitely see that on a case-by-case level in movies today, but it's definitely something you have to fight for. It's definitely something that your producers usually have to fight for talent. So there's definitely a difference there. This might seem unenticing to talent. Something about an exclusive deal can be like a difficult pill to swallow, and we'll talk about that sort of in today's day and age. And we talked about it a little bit in our last Zoom, just on a very basic level. But keep in mind, it's a rarity for talent to have consistent work and consistent income. And I think a lot of people really saw that as like a way to survive and a way to remain relevant. And it has the ability, to raise your star power, especially if you're an actor, if you're seen in more movies and those movies do well, you are going to have a lot more value and sway. That definitely comes into play when we get to the decline of the golden age here. But I would say it also helps, even if you're not like an actor, if you're a director and you can do consistent work, people are going to want to keep hiring you because they like working with you and you can produce a good movie. And there's a lot of value in that as well. Just to give you a couple of examples of actors who did have exclusive talent contracts with studios for a while. Shirley Temple, she was at Fox Film Corporation for a long time. If you ever look at Fox's sort of giant list of movies, they have tons of IP, but they have tons and tons and tons of Shirley Temple movies. So it was definitely in their best interest to make sure that they could work with her because she was such a popular child star. And then the classic, Clark Gable, he was at MGM for quite a while as well. So even people like Clark Gable, who had such sway at his time, he too also wanted to have studio exclusive contracts. Probably not for his whole career, but for definitely part of his career. Okay, so vertical integration. This is a big one. This is a big one for many reasons. So basically, vertical integration refers to the practice of major studios controlling production, distribution, and exhibition of their own films. And what it basically is, what it does is it makes sure that they get the maximum amount of money that's made from a film back into their own pockets. Sounds a little shady. It also sounds a little bit practical when you think about it, but it was definitely definitely a difficult practice at the time, and that's why it sort of became so controversial. So there were kind of a few ways to do this. One of the major practices was block booking. It's a practice in which a studio would make a deal with an exhibitor, which is usually a movie theater, to take on a block of films. And that was a mixture with basically one or two high quality films that everybody was excited to see, that had the big stars. And then there was also a slew of lesser B films, maybe with lesser known stars. Maybe the movies didn't turn out as good, whatever it is. So this would ensure that exhibitors had access to those highly anticipated popular films that they knew would draw in crowds to their theaters, and they could ramp up ticket sales that way. But they would have to also show these lesser B films down the line, studios like that, because it would be able to basically guarantee them a steady distribution stream for almost any movie that they put out. And if that doesn't make sense, I'm happy to go back into it and explain it a different way, but I think that's probably the most straightforward way to do it. So studios had a lot of sway there. Basically, they were like, if you want to stay in business and get those really exciting, popular movies that are going to do really well, you have to take these other movies. And I think, sorry, I just had a bunch of stuff pop up. Can everybody still see we're good? Okay, everybody can still see the PowerPoint, cool. But I think, obviously theaters wanted to survive. They wanted to provide a service, and this was kind of the best way to do it. There was also definitely a good amount of movie theater ownership going on, where like truly studios would, especially starting in the 1920s and into the 30s, studios would basically acquire ownership of first run theaters and cineplexes. So since they had probably a majority stake ownership in those theaters truly did not have a choice, and they definitely had to run movies that came from those studios. So that's sort of what we mean when they're sort of controlling. Obviously, we know that they're controlling production. They can take on a piece of material and give you money to fund it, and as a result, they own it. They are also a distributor, meaning they can go to exhibitors and ask them to show your movie. But in this case, they do control exhibition, because it's not so much them saying, hey, do you want to take this or not? It's really them pushing a little bit harder and saying, hey, if you want your movie theater to survive, you need to take these movies, and we'll give you this really fabulous movie on top of that. So does it sound like they're the mob? Maybe a little bit. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it in history, but that's basically what was going on. Okay, so the reason why talking about vertical integration and block booking is so important, because there were effects to this practice, and it eventually led to sort of basically the start of the decline of the studio system. So this is the Hollywood antitrust case in 1948, United States versus Paramount Pictures. I think, and the reason why Paramount Pictures is located is not just because Paramount was the only studio being sued for sort of these illegal, what they decided was ultimately illegal practices, but Paramount was the most successful studio at the time when this lawsuit was taking place. But I think all the other studios were probably sued as well. But basically, in this antitrust case, it went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. So that was kind of the final word there. But the US Supreme Court more or less upheld a US District Court of New York's decision to heavily regulate a studio's ability to control the means of exhibition specifically. Basically, the main argument for regulation is that the power that these studios held and kind of what they were doing to exhibitionists was resulting in basically, it's called an oligopoly, which is, if you don't know what that is, think of a monopoly, but instead of it just being one person or one company that's controlling everything, it's a small number of companies, in this case, basically 8. And they just felt like it was going to hurt the economy in the long run. And it's just like kind of not how a US market should work. So the US Supreme Court agreed with that. And as a result, they had to, basically studios had to limit block booking. I think in a way, block booking has kind of more or less declined over time, but they had to limit block booking by putting a cap on the number of films per block. I think it came to a maximum of 5 per block. They used to also include like short films and newsreels that would appear before a film or at the end of a film, and those weren't allowed anymore. They outlawed blind buying, which was a practice in which exhibitors would basically have to agree to buy the films without seeing them. That definitely doesn't happen today. They started implementing trade showing, which still does happen today, a practice which gives exhibitors the opportunity to view the film in advance. And I think even today, if for some reason, a very strong reason, usually if an exhibitor cannot show the film, they will not take on the film. And studios also had to divest themselves from their movie theater chains. So studios could not be owners in any movie theater chains, or they at least could not be majority stakeholders. So yeah, just wanted to sort of create more separation ultimately at the end of the day. But that was tough because that meant studios kind of lost their power. And there's a few other elements in play in that. It was, in the 40s to 45, we're at the end of World War II. There was a big shift in the economy, especially in America, in sort of the post-World War II world. There was greater consumption and consumers had more leisure options. So as a result, not everybody felt inclined to go to the movies every weekend. If fewer people were going to the movies, studios also realized that they couldn't guarantee hits, since like other things were taking up their consumers' attention and time. So they were releasing movies, and they would definitely still have hits, but they would also have more flops. And then they would just have movies that kind of like land right down the middle, meaning basically they might make enough money to recoup like the budget that they spent on the movie, but they're not really seeing many more profits after that, which is, if you want to see profits, that's like that's like part of the business of doing this. So that was a little definitely different for them, and they definitely lost some power that way, and they didn't quite know how to get it back. And frankly, that's probably an issue that people in the theatrical business are still trying to fight right now. We'll get into that when we talk about streaming. Also, there was the rise of television. Television was very much here to stay. It provided consumers with another way to watch content, and it provided consumers to watch content from the comfort of their own homes, which like was really, really appealing. Jordan, I don't know if there's anything to add here since we're talking about TV, but
No, that's what happened.
that's kind of really what happened. That's really, and also the same with, like, for example, sometimes people would go to the movies because when the war was going on, they would have newsreels updating people on what happened. And now people could be at home on television, watching the news, not having to listen, not having to just get news through the radio. It was totally revolutionary. And I'm sure it was like the precursor to Netflix and chill in a way, just the luxury of watching it all at home. But in short, basically, the world was advancing. There were more ways to entertain consumers, and movies suddenly became maybe a little less special than they were in the height of the golden age. Okay, so as the studio system was sort of on the decline, something called a star-driven system was a little bit on the rise. Talent kind of realized that maybe it wasn't the best thing to stay under exclusive contracts at one studio. It might not have been the best thing for their careers, and it also wasn't the best way to potentially make a living. And definitely once vertical integration came to an end and studios didn't have as much guarantee to just provide constant distribution for their own films, there was a huge rise in independent filmmaking, partially just because exhibitors no longer felt like they could only take on one studio's films. So many, sure, there were a few cineplexes at the times that maybe had a couple, 2 or 3 theaters, but if you have to show 4 films from one studio, you're kind of booked up. Or there were, of course, a lot of theaters that just have one screen, so you're kind of, stuck with whatever you're going to show, just that one movie. And now, since they weren't beholden to big studios, they had the ability to take on independent films, and independent films suddenly saw that they could be distributed and that they could be exhibited in theaters, and that was quite exciting. So obviously that new way of filmmaking really enticed the talent in the industry. And again, that goes all the way from actors and directors. Also, I would say definitely to your costume designers, your production designers, your editors, all those good people. It allowed them to extend themselves creatively. And again, there was always this idea that if you were under a studio contract, a studio head would basically point you in the direction of whatever project you were working on next. And in this particular case, since you weren't beholden to one studio, you could read the script and say, whoa, this kind of interests me. Maybe I want to work on it. So it definitely allowed them to expand themselves creatively, but it also coming to terms with their own value. And this is really kind of where the star-driven system comes into place. Actors, especially actors, definitely saw the benefit of utilizing their value to dictate the next moves that they made in their careers. Actors very quickly learned that their faces and their names on screen influenced ticket sales. So they were sort of able to see beyond receiving sort of a flat rate salary from one studio. Like, for example, I think Clark Gable was paid $300 a week. I mean, at the time that was a lot of money, but $300 a week when he was under NGM. And then at some point, Clark Gable said, oh, okay, but actually I can negotiate my upfront salary for every film every time in a different manner. And they also really started to participate in back-end points, back-end profits. So even some stars would say, I know this is going to be a hit. I will waive my upfront fee. You can use that in the making of the film and the production of the film, but I want a relatively significant percentage of back end. So when this movie makes a ton of profits, I might actually make more money at the end of the day than I would have if you just gave me my upfront fee or any just kind of flat rate salary that an exclusive studio would offer them. So that definitely put the power in the stars' hands in a really, really big way. And I think, like I mentioned, not just actors were seeing the benefit of this, but directors, writers, producers, department heads, et cetera. I think especially for directors, writers, and producers, this very much applies. They definitely fell in line with actors. Obviously, they knew that their faces and names wouldn't quite draw in the same way, draw moviegoers in the same way as actors do, but they were definitely falling in line with fighting for back-end participation and seeking out projects that interested them, and not necessarily, especially for producers who had exclusive hirings. For studios, they would just say, great, now you have to go produce this, now you have to go produce this. And now suddenly producers could go find the stories that interested them, package those together, make a really successful film, get some really great back-end participation on that. And I also do mention department heads in this sometimes. I think especially in indie filmmaking, if you are working on a really small budget, sometimes everybody's in agreement that they will take, say, potentially like the minimum upfront fee that they're supposed to get, and then everybody gets a little bit of the back end. And if the movie's a really great success, it all pans out. If it's not a huge success, well, you kind of knew what you were getting into in the first place. But ultimately, just so much more flexibility in how you make your choices about what films that you make, creative flexibility, financial flexibility. Yeah, the studios weren't like really, the studios, of course, are always going to be a little bit in control. They could have the ability to give you the most money depending on what you're doing, but they didn't hold all the power anymore. So for the most part, I would say there's no clear cut power holder. Maybe you could argue ultimately, maybe it's streamers, but I would say for the most part today, it's really a mix between studio power and star power. In a perfect world, you would say that they're working together to create quality content for the hungry consumer. And we're so lucky that today, given how everything's laid out, there is so much content for a hungry consumer to go through. Is it all good? That's questionable, but that was always the case. So again, I just wanted to include these icons so you can sort of see on the left-hand side of the screen, that block are really what are considered, for the most part, majors today. A lot of our players from the previous slide of icons are still there. However, Walt Disney Pictures is now in the mix and they are huge. I still also include 20th Century Studios as sort of a major, even though it's underneath the Walt Disney umbrella, or the Disney umbrella rather. They're still a big major player. They still take on a lot of material. They have IP that has always made them a major. And you'll notice, for example, so RKO, United Artists are really no longer there. On the right side of the screen, you'll see some, these aren't even all of them, but we'll call them mini majors. There's really no difference between a mini major and a major, except for frankly the size. But what's really cool about mini majors is they directly compete with majors for material, for size of films, for the stars that they go for. They're just frankly a little bit smaller in terms of company size. So for example, you notice that MGM is actually now kind of on the mini major side. They've actually just been acquired by Amazon, so that'll be kind of become a different story. But they're at this point, they're definitely smaller now than they were kind of back in their heyday, though no less important. Lionsgate's a huge mini major, TriStar, of course, Village Roadshow, Amblin, Legendary. And then I also have included, for example, Neon, Searchlight Pictures, and A24. Some people might not always classify these as mini majors. Some might just say that they are studios with distribution and not necessarily in any kind of major stage. But I do kind of include them in a major stage just because, as we talked about in our previous session about independent filmmaking, there is a clear place for independent filmmaking in Hollywood today. And these are kind of like the major studios of independent filmmaking and taking on what you would classify as an indie film. Okay, so for the industry today, just quickly, in case you kind of wanted to know what a studio executive does, they actually have relatively similar jobs to producers. They're constantly scouring every part of the industry for material and working every relationship that they have to find the next great story to bring onto their studio slate to be made into the next hit movie. So there's definitely shared interest there. So a studio executive, like producers, are evaluating scripts, books, and other IP, packages they receive usually from producers, pitches they hear from talent and producers, any other story submission materials that you can even think of, they're likely looking at it, or some kind of package or material that they're considering. And if a studio executive wants to option or purchase that piece of material, sometimes they get something that has literally no attachments, and then it's up to them to put that package together. For the most part, they're usually adding a producer first to help them with all the creative heavy lifting. Sometimes they have just great relationships with certain talent they want to bring on and then build, like, you know, a writer or a writer-director or whatever it is, and then kind of build the package out from there. But again, they are just like us. They are just kind of like us. They have to do some creative heavy lifting, especially if there's nobody there from the get-go to sort of help them out with that. Maybe, again, probably the biggest difference between a producer and a studio executive, not to say that a producer doesn't worry about financials, because they definitely do, but a studio, especially if a studio is financing your film, the studio executive is very much on top of the financials for that particular film, from development all the way through production, post-production, distribution, and release. And like, they're the people, you know, we talked about having a really, what's important about a film set is that no matter what kind of film you're making, it should feel like it's an efficiently run, focused film set. And especially, of course, when you're dealing with a lot of money, sometimes hundreds of $millions on studio films, and the studio executive is there making sure everything is in line and their money is not being wasted. That's when, of course, you want to be really focused, really efficient, on the ball, because they can always go back to their bosses and say, this is a mess, they shouldn't get any more of our money, and they can cut you off midway through production or whatever it is, or not finish your movie or not release your movie. I would say for the most part, studio executives are also liaisons between the filmmaking team and the rest of their studio. Usually their marketing and distribution teams as they work to put together a marketing and distribution plan to release your film successfully. A really good studio executive really hears out a filmmaker's vision and narrative that they want for the film, and it communicates that effectively to sort of the marketing team in the studio. But of course, the studio usually has a view in itself. So a really good studio executive is somebody who's able to kind of go back and forth and find the happy medium between, a filmmaker's view and a studio's view. Okay, so studio deals. I definitely want to bring this up because again, I even say this at the bottom, there are definite overlaps between what studios were doing in the 1920s to the 1960s and now. I think they just kind of basically call them different things. And again, there's a lot of flexibility to them. I believe, somebody asked this question in our last Zoom, and we can go a bit more in depth into this and sort of how deals work. Should you be taking on a deal that a studio offers you exclusively as an artist? And it's a little bit similar to kind of what was happening again back in the golden age of Hollywood. If you're a piece of talent or you're a producer and you have a great relationship with a studio, let's say you've made a couple of successful films before, it's not surprising that you guys are going to talk about maybe, developing a first look deal, developing an overall deal. And you have to say, well, I don't know, that's kind of restrictive. Do I want to do that? But it's also very fruitful if you really find that you all are on the same page on what the studio wants to make and put out there, what the talent and the producer want to make and put out there. And then, of course, it's also very much in the talent or the producer's ability to deliver kind of this agreed upon idea. Deals guarantee money. They definitely guarantee some power. And for the length of the deal, definitely guarantees a sense of security for the artist or producer. Again, it's very hard, especially for artists, to make a consistent income, to consistently have work. Only artists at a very, very, very high level usually find themselves in that position. So definitely a lot of pros. There can be cons though. So it's definitely about doing your vetting and feeling like, can I spend all of my time talking with these people and figuring out the right approach to a project? But of course, the studio sees a lot of benefits to this because it allows them to pool together high-level talent. And then as a result, they're pooling together usually the best of the best ideas for them to choose from. So we'll cover a few deal types. Again, we did touch on this the last time, so I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating myself. But first, to start with an overall deal, this is when anything that an artist or a producer develops is owned by their home studio. And if the studio decides to pass on it and it just has to be shelved, and an artist or an artist or a producer does not have the ability to shop that piece of material to other buyers outside of that home studio. So it's just shelved. Maybe at the end of your deal, they might say, yes, you can take a couple of these projects out. That's on a case-by-case basis. That's not usually standard. I'll also note that, and I don't think I noted this the last time, overhead money is usually provided in an overall deal. Overhead money just gives you the ability to, like, if you have an office, to pay your office expenses, to pay your employees that are working with you, things like that. So money that just helps you run your business so you can keep the creative ideas flowing. Again, a first look deal is ultimately similar to an overall deal. However, if a studio passes, it's not like they completely outright the rights and you can't take them anywhere. If a studio passes on a piece of development that you have, the artist or the producer actually has the ability to approach other buyers with the property. It also includes overhead as well. The film team, actually, I think both sides of Scott-free are just in first look deals. We're not in overall deals. The film team has a first look deal with 20th Century Studios / Disney. The television team has a first look deal with Apple. We like the flexibility of that. That works for us. Yeah, we'll kind of see what the future brings. So that's covering overall and first look deals. There's also something called a blind script deal. Frankly, from my perspective, I haven't seen this happen in the work that I've done. So Jordan, step in if it's a little bit different for TV. But basically, a blind script deal is usually between an artist and a studio. It's coming from the same place that any sort of overall deal or first look deal would come from, in the sense that you want to create a relationship with this artist. You know it's going to be fruitful. You know they have the potential to deliver something awesome. But basically, it's like a stepping stone to an overall or a first look deal, in the sense that they're going to say, okay, we're going to maybe give you one screenplay. Sometimes it's two screenplays. We're going to guarantee you money to write a couple of screenplays, a couple of pilots, You don't usually know what the ideas are up front. Usually before those deals are set, you kind of come to the table with a few ideas as the artist. The studio also probably comes to the table with a few ideas based on what they want to produce. And you kind of agree on, okay, this is the one thing. You'll write that screenplay, you'll write that pilot, whether it goes or not is one thing, but you might still have another option to write a completely different screenplay or pilot. There is no overhead money provided in this kind of deal. This is just script by script, sort of, you're just getting paid for the screenplay. That's it. But again, I think usually blind script deals go really well. And let's say you make an incredible movie out of it, or if you make a really incredible TV show out of it, it wouldn't be shocking for the studio to say, hey, why don't we talk about a first look deal? Why don't we talk about an overall deal? So as I said at the beginning of this slide, it's not hard to sense that there are some definite overlaps. But for the most part, in terms of how things are run, there's just so much more creative flexibility these days for the artists, for producers, whoever that is. And also there's just a greater understanding that an artist or a producer is going to fight harder basically for their worth. They're going to push for better deals. Not to say that like everybody in the golden age of Hollywood was just submissive to studios, but studios had way more leverage, and that's not the case anymore. I think talent realizes that they have leverage, that they can make a scene, that especially like with social media and everything, that they have followers who will follow them and not follow the studio. They don't care who the studio is. That's not valuable to them. So what you're really seeing is that the studio system and the star-driven system are kind of working hand in hand to create this sort of new hybrid. And all that is to say, these deals, streamers do these deals too. We're just kind of talking about streamers separately. Streamers really kind of operate a lot like theatrical studios. They just have a different exhibition platform. That's like probably the biggest difference. Streaming is relatively brief, not just, at least in this slideshow for film, not because they're not important to talk about, but streaming is relatively new. They have a much shorter history. They have a history that's still developing. I think it's hard to sort of dictate what exactly the patterns are going to be in streaming because it's changing so rapidly, especially in the past few years, especially in the past year with COVID. So it's a little hard to make comparisons, whereas obviously theatrical distribution and movie making has been around for so long. The rise of streaming platforms has disrupted basically everything we know about business, technology, culture, and content. I know that's so loaded and I don't really go into it, but there's probably some element of your life that has been influenced by streaming in some way, whether it's your personal habits, how you make investments, what kind of technology you use, and how you interact with your friends. When you're looking at Hollywood specifically, the rise of streaming has really highlighted what some people call antiquated practices, most notably theatrical distribution. And what streaming is really doing is like straight up challenging studios in this race to hold on to the most consumers. I personally don't think going to a movie theater is antiquated. I still love to do it. I would never want that to die, but I also highly recognize that I spend a lot of time at home watching Netflix and anything on streaming, and in a perfect world, there's probably a good balance of both. There are definitely movies that should be probably watched on a really big screen and not at home, but we're just going to have to see how that battle plays out. Yeah, kind of similar to the rise of television, streaming has just created different ways to watch content on more platforms, and also just for like less money than a movie ticket or a monthly cable bill, which really means that streaming is coming for television too. Nobody can hide. That's really the argument here. And a major benefit to streaming is the unbelievable increase in content. As I said before, there's a lot of I mean, it's subjective because it's about your taste, but I would say there's probably a lot of poor quality content out there, but there is so much good content too. And I think, of course, it's important to know that the golden age we're probably in right now is very much of television. I definitely find myself maybe watching a little bit more television than I do movies, which is a little sacrilege because I'm on the film team here, but it's kind of the reality of it. They're just having a great moment. They're taking really big risks, and kudos to them. And streaming has definitely been a contributing factor to that. So of course, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO Max, those are definitely considered majors within the streaming studio world. Apple TV as well, even though it's a little bit newer, it's kind of come in definitely ready to play, not to be taken lightly whatsoever. And then you're seeing, places like Paramount knows that it wants to get its viewers watching their content pretty much no matter what, whether it's in a theater, whether it's on a television at home. So they've done things like create Paramount Plus. HBO also did that with HBO Max. Peacock for NBC. So it gives them sort of this exclusivity to their brand to then show, of course, movies and TV shows that their brand makes. So in a way, we'll get to this in a second, but basically something like Paramount Plus is a way for Paramount to once again control the means of exhibition without breaking any laws on the theatrical side, but that's changing as well. But then you're going to see things like BritBox. I personally have never used BritBox, but I know it's incredibly popular because British television is so incredible. So BBC's packet and ITV package together a lot of the television shows and films that they have, and they can put it all on this one platform for you to watch. Criterion Collection, which really just like started out as like an idea to celebrate independent filmmaking, has its own app now. And what you're also seeing is that channels again are like cable television channels are creating sort of their own exclusive streaming apps. Showtime, ESPN, Stars does it. It's going to be endless, and I can imagine it's only going to continue to grow with time, especially if television stays as hot as it has been, which I'm sure it will. I think it's important to recognize that streamers might have been really inspired by the studio system because streamers have been designed to control all means of production, distribution, and exhibition. They've also taken extra steps to hold on to as much of the profits as possible. I can't go too much into this, one, partially because streamers are not transparent at all with how they kind of make money at the end of the day. So I don't have enough experience to go into that. Maybe somebody else does. But what a lot of streamers usually do, since you're not putting it in theaters, there's no metric that's measuring the same way as like ticket sales to suggest, to dictate how much somebody, depending on how much somebody has on their back end. So like if a director is getting like 5% of the back end, there was a way to measure that based on ticket sales and profits in movie theaters. Since movies that come out exclusively on streamers aren't subject to the same metrics, it's a little hard to measure it. And I think because streamers probably don't quite want people to know how that metric works, it suggests it's a little bit maybe of an uneven metric. They basically try to buy out all above the line elements that do have any back end, or even below the line elements that have any back end participation. So what they do is if they're going to put a movie into production, or even a movie that they've acquired, that a finished movie that they've acquired that they're just going to release on their platform, they will either make a deal that says, okay, here's your upfront fee, and then we're also going to pay you this flat fee instead of you getting back end percentage. It's like an additional flat fee to buy them out, to basically say you're only going to get this, and if there was like a version where your movie would have made more, you don't have the ability to get that extra money because you no longer have back end. If it's something they're acquiring, they'll look at the deals that have been kind of made in the process and then sort of figure out what's the appropriate buyout number. That's kind of tricky because it's exciting potentially for the filmmakers involved in a film to make a lot of money up front. And if for some reason the movie bombs on a streaming platform, again, I can't quite tell you how that works. It's really a measurement of household viewerships. That's great. You weren't going to make any back end money anyway, but you've got like a really nice sort of flat fee as a result. However, if the movie's a huge success, the streaming studio is ultimately reaping all the benefits of that, and you aren't. Definitely a tricky situation, but it's kind of the reality of what it is right now. It's going to get trickier, especially when you have, well, the pandemic's making it trickier. We'll get into that in a second. But as I mentioned, the future of exhibition in Hollywood is going to change. It's going to change very rapidly. In fact, so that Paramount case that I mentioned that kind of ruled out block booking, the U.S. Justice Department has actually recently revisited what's called the Paramount Consent Decrees, which kind of laid out all that regulation they put into place at the height of the golden age, at the height of the studio system. And they've made moves to actually eliminate them, which will effectively end the ban on vertical integration for large studios. In short, the reasoning is that the world is different, the marketplace is different, consumer habits have changed. There's so many more ways to view content. It's very unlikely that theatrical studios that already have less power than they did to begin with have the ability to sort of get a hold on exhibitors in the way that they did back in the 1920s up to the 1940s. They just think it's really unlikely, so they're not afraid to let studios try ultimately again. So I think in August 2020, they started what's called a sunset termination period, which is like the ultimate phasing out of this. It just basically says, okay, in 2 years, you'll be able to start the practice of vertical integration again, but it's giving studios and exhibitors time to adjust. So it's not just something that has to quickly change overnight. I ultimately think what that's going to mean is that there are going to be tons more streaming apps, because it seems like with the success of places like Netflix, Paramount Plus, Amazon, that kind of exhibition platform gives studios the most control and kind of almost eliminates the middleman to an extent. I also think independently run movie theaters, usually movie theaters with like 1 or 2 screens, are going to be a little bit freaked out, because depending on how this works, they may not have as much business to turn to. We'll see. It's going to be tricky. I would also say major world events absolutely spark change. The COVID-19 pandemic kind of turned Hollywood upside down in a huge way. Of course, obviously, nobody was going to theaters for over a year. People are starting to slowly trickle back to theaters, at least in LA and New York. It's a little hard to know, especially with the Delta variant on the rise, if that trickling back is going to even stick. So what's really happening is, for example, you would normally have like an exclusive with theatrical window before your movie goes on, to iTunes to be rented or purchased, onto Amazon to be rented or purchased. And then after that, it goes on to streaming services that have decided to license the movies. And there's been like major upset about what that exclusive theatrical window should be. Like, truly the number of days. Should it be something closer to a month? Should it be closer to 14 days, 17 days, whatever it is? And I'm sure that's a conversation that's going to go on for a very long time, sadly. Yeah, again, so much. That's why this is relatively short just on the streaming side, because so much is changing so rapidly. It's a little hard to know where it's going to go. And it's really young history, doesn't really give you a sense that, like, it's hard to dictate from its young history how it's going to pan out. I think consumer habits will probably dictate a lot of that. We'll see.
One of the interesting things to be aware of when you're looking at the American streaming market is the deep degree of corporate consolidation. It actually underlies it. If you look at this chart on the left, you'll see that even though there are a kind of myriad streamers one can bring their content to, in reality, there's really only about 4 or 5 companies that control all of those different buyers. And so what our business is going through in television is a rapid consolidation, and it's not making the job of what we do, which is creating content, any easier, because as these companies continue to merge, the leadership structures change, the mission statements relative to what kind of brand they want to be change, and it makes for a great degree of chaos. And I think it's also worth noting that if you're looking at the streaming market, there are very different reasons for each company to be in it. If you look at a company like Amazon, Amazon measures its success based on Prime subscriptions, and Prime subscriptions, as they exist here in the United States, are really about getting people to use their general store, essentially. And that Prime is when you don't have to pay shipping, and things come to you fast. So the idea is that if you can get people to sign up for Amazon Prime to watch a television show, they're also going to buy diapers and cat toys and groceries and everything else from Amazon. So it's really kind of a way to drive their larger business. It is not their core business, not by a long shot. With a company like Apple, Apple's traditionally been a hardware company, meaning that they make phones and computers and things like that. And only when they got into the business of streaming music primarily, and then later with iTunes being a destination to rent things, have they started to say, hey, look, we should be creating original content. But again, it's not their core business. They're, I think, one of the richest companies in the world, if not the richest company in the world. And so it remains to be seen how much of a priority original content will remain for Apple over the next 5 to 10 years. HBO Max is a very new streaming platform. It is part of the Warner Brothers HBO. It was once AT&T, now it's Discovery, but that's part of a bigger corporate family. And that was really born out of the idea of, HBO has a very specific kind of, I would say, rarefied brand. It's not always the most broadly appealing place. And I think they wanted to use that label to reach more people. And so HBO Max is kind of the streaming counterpart to HBO that does more, I would say, accessible and populist content. So they're very keen to leverage their sister company, Warner Brothers DC library. So they're doing a lot of superhero stuff and things like that, because that seems to be what gets consumers excited these days. A great example of a major company that Rebecca made reference to earlier is Disney. Disney merged with Fox, and the Murdoch family kept, I think, maybe Fox Broadcasting, the actual broadcast channel. They kept sports and they kept Fox News, but everything else went over to Disney. And that's obviously kind of created a mega company. And under that corporate umbrella are two labels I'm sure you guys both all know and love, which is Marvel. They acquired Marvel. They also have Lucasfilm, which is all the Star Wars stuff. I mean, so you can imagine that's quite a behemoth. And they take all of those assets and then they drive them to their streaming platform, as well as feature films, but in the form of Disney Plus, which is where you see the Mandalorian and the Marvel series, et cetera. So Netflix, totally different kind of company. It's all they do is streaming. They have no legacy library, so they can't draw off of the old Warner Brothers movies, the old Paramount movies, or the HBO series from the last 20 years. So they have been the most aggressive in terms of creating original content, because when they'd initially started that company, they were able to license contents from the major studios, which was probably kind of a boneheaded thing of the studios to let happen. But as they've come to become wiser to the fact that their own libraries are what were in many cases causing people to tune into Netflix. For example, Friends is a Warner Brothers show. Seinfeld is an NBC Universal show. They said, hey, wait a second, we want those back on our streaming platforms. And so Netflix was left to really generate a great deal of their own programming to compete. But they don't have any other business. All they do is this. So you can kind of see, the ways in which, while there are a seemingly like infinite choices, there are only a handful of corporate overlords that we all work for. And so, it makes for quite a kind of unpredictable market. And as Rebecca was explaining, it's like we've only been in the streaming world for probably 10, maybe 12 years. And it's really hard to know kind of where it's all going. And then there are other players in the media space like Google and Facebook, who have, dabbled in streaming, who may still come into this market in some meaningful way. And then there's what we call basic cable. And, basic cable in the United States is literally what it sounds like. There is a cable that's under the ground that runs into your TV set. And that's typically been how people have gotten content before it started coming in through your internet. And so those channels are ad supported primarily, meaning they advertisers, there's commercials. Not always the case of HBO or Showtime or Starz, those are subscription services. But again, they still come through a cable company. And, depending on what region of the United States you live in, you're basically subjected to a particular cable company's literal cables. And so you pay a fee to them and you get, 200 channels. That model is, rapidly diminishing as more and more people, which we call cord cutters, have said, this is not a fee we're interested in paying anymore if we can get all of the things we want a la carte through our streaming subscriptions. And so, there's that business is, scrambling to kind of figure out how it fits into this new reality. But needless to say, there's still great programming made on what we call basic cable, whether it's FX, whether it's Showtime, whether it's HBO, the USA, TNT, they are still viable buyers for us, but it remains to be seen how they may survive this iteration. And then I think, and not to put them last, because they still are the most watched shows in the United States for sure, are the broadcast networks. And the broadcast networks are available without any fee. They're free. They come in through the air into an antenna. So anybody can watch them. And so they don't require, candidly, all the financial outlay that having these streaming subscriptions require, as well as cable subscriptions. And so a lot of Americans still watch broadcast shows. And so those are your shows that still get numbers in the tens of millions, whether they be The Masked Singer or The Bachelor or NCIS or CSI. I mean, those are your kind of giant broadcast shows, and they primarily exist on 4.5 platforms. CW is more youth oriented. But so they're still making content that's expensive, that's getting lots and lots of eyeballs. So, but that tends to be truly the most broadly appealing, because they're servicing the most diverse audience out there, and an audience that, isn't necessarily reading in the New York Times about what the best show that Apple is doing. So, there is still a very robust business, and we certainly do still look to those networks as places for us to make television shows, and they tend to spend a lot of money on their shows too. They tend to be quite expensive, which translates to us producers as nice fees and nice budgets. So, there is a little bit of a snobbery, I would say, in the TV business about these 4 networks, but for me, what brought me into this business was the hope of reaching lots and lots and lots of people. I grew up in the time when broadcast networks were primarily your only television. And so, I still like the idea that there's something very democratic about the broadcast networks, and that some of the streamers can be pretty rarefied, and are kind of programming to very specific niche audiences. So, that's the kind of American television landscape. And obviously a lot of these companies are operating globally and are making deals in various territories around the world as we speak. So it is a rapidly changing business, and one that it'll be really interesting to see how it evolves over the next 10, 20 years. And particularly for you guys who are, kind of entering the business at this junction point, there's something very exciting about starting your career when things are in a state of change, because you'll have the ability to kind of get ahead of things and get comfortable with things. So I think, there's some real excitement out there about what's possible. And as Rebecca said, television, and I put it in quotes, it can be kind of anything these days. It can be a 4-hour limited series, it can be a 10-hour limited series, it can be a 5-year series, like 5 years of 12 episodes a season. It can be kind of anything. And so, from just strictly a storyteller perspective, that's really exciting, because there was a time when it was only 22 episodes a year and it had to go on forever. And that's not the case anymore. Not every story is best told that way. That's streaming in the studio system. Thanks, guys.
I mean, what's really quite fascinating about streaming is in so many respects how it's turned the industry on its head, because I find it really interesting just looking at, for argument's sake, just one film, and for me, the structure and how a film like Forrest Gump was made, I find absolutely fascinating because of the epic battle between the studio in terms of trying to restrict the budget, and then ultimately Robert Zemeckis and Tom Hanks putting money in to try and get the film made. And I mean, it just fascinates me looking at the history of how these films were made, and then how it actually impacts on streaming today, turning the whole kind of model on its head. That if people were to invest so much money in something like that at such huge risk, and then sell it to a streamer, they wouldn't benefit in the same way that obviously Zemeckis and Tom Hanks had a nice, healthy bite of the back end on Forrest Gump.
Not for the most part. Yeah, I mean,
No.
once you go into their, it is a studio system, as Rebecca illustrated, in terms of they own all the means of production. You're kind of outside of the field of transparency about how successful or how watched that film is. And keep in mind, the streamer's metric is all about subscriptions and growth. So, they have a finite audience to drive your film to. So it's not like they would see it as a win if they can get new subscribers after a film, but that's not necessarily something you as a filmmaker will ever be able to have them monetize and compensate you for. So
that's what I'm saying.
It's a strange.
It's also, I mean, it can also feel like, I think independents definitely see the viability of a streamer acquiring their finished film. Like, for example, I think, our president on the film side, Kevin Walsh, produced this movie Manchester by the Sea that Kenny Lonergan directed with Casey Affleck. Went on to be nominated for Best Picture awards at the Oscars. Casey Affleck won a bunch of Best Actor awards. Michelle Williams is in it as well. She was nominated for a lot. I think they made that movie for like $8 million, and it premiered at Sundance, and Amazon Prime was really kind of up and coming and trying to be aggressive about acquiring award-winning films for their streaming service, and they paid like 12 or 13 million dollars. So even though also there was a theatrical release involved, I don't know the specifics of that deal, so maybe they did still see some back end, but even just acquiring the film for $12 million when they made it for $8 million, an independent film, that's a huge win. Like, there's a lot of money to go around, which is really exciting. And again, it was released in theaters, so I don't know what the specifics are there. And that is actually kind of what's kind of strange moving forward. And I think COVID has really perpetuated that. Like, for example, with Disney Plus didn't know what to do with Mulan. They tried to push it a bunch of times. They didn't know what to do with Black Widow. They tried to push it a bunch of times. And ultimately what's happening is they're releasing films simultaneously in theaters and then on Disney Plus for a premium price of like, I think it's like $30, which is a lot. I know. To like watch the movie for like $30. I definitely haven't done that. I think I'd rather go pay to be in a movie theater if I'm going to do that at all, even though 2 movie tickets is basically $30. That's my point of view. But what's tough is, you'll see this, is that filmmakers are going to come to those studios and say, well, wait a second. If you put this on streaming originally, you would just buy me out and I wouldn't have any back end. But now you're putting it on streaming and you're going to potentially give it a 2, 3, 4 week window in theaters. So am I getting some kind of buyout? Am I also getting part of the back end? So that's going to definitely be a new way that deals are looked at and made. And that's going to be a huge point of contention across the board. Something else, Seton, you mentioned, something like Forrest Gump is such a good example, or like another example where the studio system really worked for somebody. Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ. He couldn't get anybody to finance that film, so he financed it himself. I think it was like around $40-50 million. And then it made like $600 million at the box office, and he was able to reap all of that back end because he had no other investors in it. There you go. It would be so unlikely today that anybody would pay even close to that number if it was just acquired by a streamer. It just would not happen.
Funny you make that point, because in my sense, the most you can't say put a degree of comparison to unique, but the most unique value proposition, as I see it, would be in the value of your premise, your idea, you're coming up with something that's just unique and amazing, and then the way you write it. We've got a lot of script writers here, so my sense would be that's where the biggest investment should be. It's just coming up with such a kick-ass kind of offbeat, wacky, incredible idea that's quite low budget, because it might not in fact involve the kind of locations that Forrest Gump involved, although they shot everything in one sort of town. But yeah, it would just, to me, that's really where the value lies in young people developing content, would be just to come up with the most extraordinary script and idea and make it for a very low budget, and then hopefully it just kicks.
It's definitely, 100%. It's definitely a way to do it, especially like when Jordan talked about with Netflix. They don't have these years and years of IP under their belts to like constantly root their streaming service in success as a way to constantly build new subscribers. So they have to take big risks on putting out mostly original content out there. And so they definitely see the value, you're right, and paying a little extra for something cheap, but that could be really amazing and draw a lot more viewers, since they don't have the ability to fall back on Friends, fall back on The Sopranos, fall back on The Wire, whatever those, fall back on Breaking Bad, whatever those historic shows. Even though I think you can watch Breaking Bad on Netflix right now, potentially, but that's because they've licensed it. It's not because they have the IP and they really own it. It's not part of their core history. Netflix doesn't have a creative history like other platforms do.
What you brought up was exactly what I wanted to talk about and ask, is just the amount of flexibility that streamers provide in terms of actually staying true to like a scriptwriter's original work. Like in your experience, do places like Netflix streamers give a lot more of that than say a studio, or does it just depend more on the relationship that you guys have?
It's a little bit of a mix. So it's always, at the end of the day, Hollywood is relationship based. So the stronger your relationship, and usually for an artist, but if they've had a pretty good track record, like, when David Fincher brings a project into Netflix, like Mank, or something like that, Netflix basically took on Mank one because they wanted to, really primarily because they wanted to work with David Fincher. They're going to have this really cool up and coming project with Michael Fassbender that sounds like it's very different from Mank. And I think that's really kind of what they were getting at. But for the most part, they were like, David, you've made a lot of really good movies. They bring in a lot of viewers. I think for the most part, they don't give them a lot of notes. If it's with less successful filmmakers, with producers who maybe they haven't worked with before, they're probably going to be very much hands-on. And I think that's relatively standard throughout. However, I think it is important to note that, especially a place like Netflix, they didn't have they didn't have much to lose when they started out. So they were okay with being really aggressive, taking really big risks, taking chances on material that seemed really strange. And then obviously it's, remember kind of like, not to like quote the movie, but in The Social Network, they talk about like Facebook and putting ads on Facebook. And Mark was like, no, like there's the party. We don't know what this is yet. Nobody's going to come to the party if it's not cool and ads don't make that thing. Netflix ultimately got out far enough, saw what was working for their platform and not working for their platform, and they've changed it up. I think maybe one of the better examples that happens specifically at Scott Free is like 4 years ago, we made this film called The Earthquake Bird, written and directed by this filmmaker named Wash Westmoreland. It's based on a book of the same name by an English author. And it's like a slow burn noir thriller, takes place in Japan. It's about 30% in Japanese, which is really cool. So there's a great sort of international element in there that not only English language countries can get excited about that film, but also Japan can get excited about that film. One, because it was shot there, and two, because a lot of it's in their language. That was a huge artistic risk for certain executives at Netflix to take. And frankly, I think today they don't take that risk at all right now.
I would agree with Rebecca. I think, there was a moment maybe 5 or 8 years ago in television, at least, where there was so many streamers that had kind of emerged into the scene at the same time, that there was a hunger for content that came, and what came with it was a little less oversight and a little bit more adventurousness. I think that time has passed, but I think there are two things to keep in mind. I think one, the streamers in particular are using the data that they collect on all of us and how we watch TV to drive very specific content to very specific groups of people, which is different than broadcasting. It's called, niche casting, and narrow casting is what they refer to it. So in that regard, there may be opportunities for idiosyncratic material to get made because they're making it for a very specific demographic that they know will respond passionately to it. On the other hand, if they're looking to reach, have a hit, a big, broad kind of, flagship series that brings the most possible people to their platform, they are taking as heavy a creative hand as one would expect. And so, at the end of the day, all of our jobs is to try to cajole and protect and manipulate to a degree so that we can protect the things that are creatively important to us. But we all work for the man, and the man gets to tell us like what the man wants, you know what I mean? And that is just a reality of it. So the kind of, to Seaton's original point about finding really unique and quirky and interesting things always should be the baseline by which, the creative process begins. And then the process, the job that me and Rebecca are always doing is to try to continue to protect that thing as it goes through what is just a sausage factory of corporate interference and feedback. And again, not all these people there are a lot of really brilliant, very friendly, very cool studio executives, but they answer to like shareholders and markets and investors and people who have not a creative bone in their body. They just want to see the profits come back to them. So, it is art versus commerce. It's like it's that tension is what defines what we do for a living. I mean, that is just what we'd be painters or novelists if we, or poets if we couldn't negotiate. So
exactly.
A lot of these places, these legacy companies have lots of IP, as we talked about. And, you know, when we're looking at the DC comic library, we're looking at the Marvel library, you know, there seems to be a real appetite, a sincere and real appetite to bring new voices and young voices into the fold to kind of reimagine those properties. And that's a place that I find that there's lots of opportunity for kind of young creative people to be drafted into something that can be, I mean, you guys know how big these movies are. They're massive, but it seems to be a place where, you know, having that kind of younger, passionate, diverse perspective is really valued. And it's also an enormous stepping stone from independent film into kind of like the big leagues. I mean, if you look at a filmmaker like Colin Trevorrow or whatever, who did this tiny movie about time travel. What the hell is that called? That movie he made?
Safety Not Guaranteed.
Yes.
Safety Not Guaranteed. Yes, thank you. Tiny movie with, you know, quirky characters, was premiered at Sundance, and then I think the next thing he made was Jurassic Park. Like, so like there seems to be a fair that kind of transition from making a really great low budget independent film in your home country or that goes into the festival circuit can often be, there's often this kind of stepping stone into kind of major filmmaking if you're going through those very, you know, those DC and Marvel properties and Lucasfilm, and, you know, there's a lot of these kinds of libraries that people are looking to update and make contemporary and bring new voices into. And so, you know, that's something that when you guys are thinking about something that's a high concept or involves, you know, science fiction or superheroes, and you're able to find a way to make it on a low budget, that can often, if that gets the right attention, that can often lead you to some really exciting opportunities here with those particular kind of properties and IP.
Yeah, Ryan Coogler is another really good example.
Oh, perfect example.
Going from like Fruitvale Station to Creed to Black Panther and Black Panther 2.
Yeah.
Marvel really does that. Like Kate Shortland, she's an Australian filmmaker. She has all of her smaller, she loves independent filmmaking, but also Australia doesn't make the biggest films ever if they're going to finance them. And she just focused so much on strong female characters. So it was no surprise when Marvel tapped her to, you know, to helm Black Widow, which is a focus on a strong female character.
Lee Isaac Chung, who did Minari, who's now working on a Lucas property, or Chloe Zhao, who did Nomadland, who's now doing The Immortals. Like that is like that was never the case before. Like you did not go from a tiny movie to you know, $150 million Marvel movie in the past, but that seems to really be a very ripe kind of path in our business. And these are filmmakers from all over the globe: Australia, China, you know, Korea. I mean, these are not all American filmmakers, not by a long shot. So that to me is a really cool, and you know, especially if like you're into that stuff already, you know, as many people are. Yeah, as many people are.
Yeah, I was just thinking that's what makes the streaming platform so exciting for people like us in South Africa, where it, you know, hasn't been so accessible for us. And I heard in another webinar that because of the subscription base that Netflix works on, that's why they are now aggressively pushing local content in the local, and then that, you know, that's why so much things like Korean cinema and all of that's become so popular all over, because people are now able to access it on these streaming platforms.
Oh, and like, yeah, you have the ability as a person in any country to view the content of another country. Yeah. So, you know, when you're looking at things that, you know, like I remember when I watched that show Dark, it's a German show, I probably wouldn't have had access to it any other way. And, you know, there are all sorts of shows that break out of other territories and become global hits. And you're right, it is very unique because it took, you know, if you made a show in South Africa, you'd often had to then, you know, go to find an American distributor, sometimes years later, who would pick it up and maybe put it in second run in the middle of the night on, you know, on CBS or whatever. And now you have this kind of from the local market to the global market in you know, and that's really, and that's exciting as a fan, because I definitely don't think United States or, you know, has a monopoly on great stuff. Not at all. So yeah, you're right. That's a,
I mean, I think it did happen before as well. I mean, I was just thinking about The Piano, Jane Campion, you know, she had never really directed anything massive, you know, before that. I mean, and I mean, the obvious other one is District 9. But, you know, then we know why that happened, because.
But much rarer and took a lot more time. because you'd have to get a festival to pay attention, and you have to win the festival. You have to get the press to pay attention. And there is something so immediate about the world we live in now, in terms of you make something and instantly it's available globally, which is pretty cool. And there's no gatekeepers. You don't need like the New York Times to give you 5 stars, or, Cannes to put you in the festival. It just is about whether people, the gatekeepers, Netflix, that's driving your show to very specific people.
I also think it has a lot to do with an unshakable belief in yourself. Because I knew Jane Campion in Australia when she was a teenager. And she was absolutely and utterly focused. So I don't know anybody who was more focused in terms of what she ultimately intended to do with her life, So it wasn't like there was any debate about where she was going or what she was going to achieve, And I think there's a lot to be said for obviously not being unrealistic in that focus and that obsession, because you could become a lunatic and fall off a cliff. But there's a lot to be said for that unshakable conviction, which you then,
Absolutely.
take small achievable steps to achieve in your life. There's a lot to be said for that.
It's like a calling. I really don't think you undertake being a screenwriter or a director, or an actor for that matter, as something that you just kind of want to see what happens. Like it requires a great deal of sacrifice. It requires many years of hard work, some of it not paid or paid well. It requires traveling away from your family and friends for periods of time. It requires believing in yourself when there are periods where you're not working, and you're not being paid. And so I have a lot of admiration for people who are driven in that way, because it's not even when you're successful at it, it's just not an easy life. You have to make compromises on other areas of your life to do it. And so I agree with you, Seton. It really does require a great deal of determination, and a great deal of focus, and sacrifice to really do these things. But how rewarding is it as an artist to see something you believe in and have nurtured come to fruition? And that's the thing that we live for, which is that part of the process. So with sacrifices, but with great rewards potentially. So both personally and professionally.
And an unbelievably thick skin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yes.
Which you'll develop. If you feel like you don't have a thick skin going into this, I definitely didn't. My first job was at a talent agency, which gives you a thick skin right away. And my skin is definitely thicker than when I started. So don't feel like that's something you need to have. You probably won't have it in the beginning. It'll be difficult. It'll be difficult even when you have a thick skin, but you ultimately get it.
And no one individual you shouldn't take any one individual's view on you or your work as the word of, as the final word.
Definitely not.
It's just
otherwise I wouldn't be doing this job.
I wouldn't either. My parents have already told me multiple times to go find another type of job. So I would have quit ages ago. So yeah, I think you do have to have a tough skin, but also like, okay, so that person didn't dig what I did, but maybe there's something constructive in there I can take forward, and I'll just keep plugging away. But yes, the ability to not take things personally and the ability to not dwell on those setbacks is really important, and it's something you cultivate and you over time for sure.
I think a thick skin is accretive.
Yes, I would agree.
Very much.
But I think it has to be kind of consciously nurtured. I think you have to remind yourself consciously of that, because it's very easy to take offense. It's very easy to feel attacked. It's very easy to get discouraged and to let those insecurities kind of rule your emotional reaction to things. But you always have to go, okay, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to, I don't like the way that they said it, but maybe there's something there. Maybe they had a bad day. Maybe I'm having a bad day. Like, I think being as kind of measured and about when you encounter feedback and when you encounter people's opinions is helpful, because it's our business is built on opinions, and not everybody's right.
No, that's so true. No, and all that is to say, it makes us who are not, we're creatively inclined, but I'm not a creative. I don't write, I don't direct, I don't act. More power to you all, because it's hard to make it. Your name's on the thing. So of course it feels personal. So in a way you almost have to take extra care. But in a way that means you probably also gain the best perspective.
What are some of the things that came at you guys that really, really got you down and you had to work to overcome. So that I can kind of prepare.
When I was coming up, people were still throwing staplers at their assistants. People were still screaming and everyone could hear and insulting each other. People were treating each other really pretty terribly. And it was a bit of a badge of honor to be a bad boss and to kind of haze your employees and all of that as a way of being like, well, someone did it to me, so I'm going to do it to you. It's a rite of passage. That shit is being brushed aside, whether it was through Me Too or, those types of, so it's become a much, much more civilized business, so hopefully the thick skin that we had to cultivate won't be something that you'll necessarily encounter to the same degree. But I think it's being very conscious and present and not letting yourself kind of get whipped up by all of these external factors that you don't have control over. You don't have control over the market. You don't have control over how an investor may view something. You don't have control over the feedback your friends give you. All you can do is take it in and try to filter out what's useful to you, and then set aside the stuff that's noise or not helpful, and try not to say, "Oh my God, it's something I did," and look at it as something that's a reaction they're having, and it's creative. So it's really hard. Like sometimes you send something to someone, it's like, there's a character in there that they just don't like because like they reminds of someone they went to school with, or it's about a subject they're really sensitive about. Like you don't kind of know all the ways in which people process your work. And so I think it's good to just kind of always have a little bit of distance from the stuff that feels, it's like you have to kind of just like be like, remind yourself, I think, to be like, yo, that it's one person's opinion or it's one person's reaction. It's not. I don't know.
And I think on top of that, again, as Jordan said, what's great is just the way in which people are treating people is changing. So you're right. It's not like you're necessarily going to have a stapler thrown at your head, which thankfully I never have. But and I've never thrown a stapler at anybody's head either. But because it's a creatively driven industry, that means it's also an emotionally driven industry. And, whether definitely that feeling of reminding yourself, it's just one day, it's just one task, whatever that is, you'll get over it. It's also just throwing yourself, like the more experience you have, the thicker your skin will also become, because there's so much you're not going to know how to do. And you might have the best attitude about it and be like, whatever I can do to solve it. That was like always my view. I'm just here to be helpful. Whatever you need, like that is like always my going in point. And then I'd be given something that I don't know how to do. And I would be like, this is, oh my gosh, if I screw this up, the entire movie is going to implode. And then I'd find out I'd guess and somehow do the thing like right, or I would need help, or I'd do something wrong and I need help to fix it or whatever it is. And then I would realize that the movie did not implode. And what you kind of come to learn is the more you know how to do in situations that are unfamiliar to you, then you can start to compartmentalize, oh, this is actually a really minor thing. My bosses, who are like the real producers of the movies, are dealing with these really, really big things that'll actually make the movie fall apart. So it's all about me taking all those little steps to get up there. So I'm at the point where I know what a really stressful situation is. I know how to deal with it. I know how to make sure I can keep the movie from falling apart, or the movie's going to fall apart. And at least I know I did everything I could do to make sure that didn't happen. And then that's just Hollywood. There's only so much out of, in your control there.
And being fearless. There's something, I know people like this, and I think and I've heard people who are very successful say this in retrospect, which is like, I didn't know what I was doing. So I didn't know what the pitfalls were. So I kind of just went headlong into it. And I think there's something kind of wonderful about, and that to me is just, it's enthusiasm and determination, but like, be as fearless as you can be. And don't be afraid of what someone might think or say. I know that's a hard thing to do and to feel, but I think it can be enormously beneficial in terms of that confidence that Seaton was talking about with a filmmaker like Jane Campion. I mean, Ridley has that in spades. Like,
oh my gosh, yes.
He's fearless. He says what he does. I mean, he goes charging in there. He's like, I know what I'm doing. And it's not in a negative way, not in a mean-spirited way, not in a dictatorial way, but, that confidence is, especially if you're a director, everyone on that set is looking at you for that vision, and confidence is a big part of that.
There's a huge element of chance here as well. I mean, clearly, I just think about Gary Marshall and Pretty Woman. he didn't really seem to know what he was doing. And he did each shot 3 different times or 3 different ways, but kind of they just needed a comedic quality that he brought to it from his Fonz experience and all that kind of thing, and somehow it worked. But it wasn't like he was
Tons of
totally in
chance.
control.
It's not a meritocracy. It's just, I wish it were, it's not. A lot of who succeeds and how they succeed is entirely kind of driven by chance and luck and timing and things that are not about your personal worth as an artist. They're just not. And I'm sure you guys have experienced that even in school and with your own friends and stuff. And I think keeping yourself above the fray of all of that and trying not to compare yourself to other people and question why this person succeeded and why haven't I, and all, it's a waste of your brain space. Apply it to the stuff that matters. But yes, to Seaton's point, if only the very best were the most successful, if only. But it is a luck and happenstance and timing driven business in a lot of ways.
What do you want to say?
When you're in the shit and you are in a bad environment, as I've been the person who's had things thrown at me lots of times, is make sure you have a support network of your peers who you can connect with when something terrible happens or you feel really terrible, you get bad notes, you call somebody else who's a filmmaker, because you guys are all filmmakers, and say, I just got these terrible notes. Has this happened to you? This is what happened. And inevitably somebody else has had a bad experience, and just connecting on that level really helps take the sting out of it.
People find peer groups to provide that support before they take anything outside of that group. I have plenty of friends who have been doing that for a decade. They still have their buddies from college that they share their stuff with.
The pandemic obviously took a lot of money from people, and people have different priorities, like you were saying, Rebecca, earlier. With World War II and post-World War II, how people viewed movies, people started watching television. Since this is happening, will studios be more accessible to independent filmmakers instead of it being a close-knit family of people? Because it seems like the same people keep making movies in the studios, or it's based on your reputation or who you know. But since now, streaming platforms sort of control the market, and I feel like as much as people still love going to the movies, it has changed. And we just have to get used to this new change that we're dealing with. But will this make studios more accessible to independent filmmakers, like how Netflix is working with small companies in South Africa? For example, Escape Room 1, it was shot here in South Africa. It was $9 million, the budget. Box office was $155 million. So it was quite a success. But Escape Room 2 now is basically about to get released if it's not released now. I'm kind of watching, is it going to be as successful or more successful than the previous one? Since the whole theater is taken out of the equation now, and they sort of have to go to streaming platforms. How is that changing everything now?
So to address the first, I think a lot of what you said is so true. And I don't fully know the answer of what exactly is going to happen, but to address the first part of your question, in a perfect world, studios should be open to working with any caliber of talent if they really believe in their talent and their vision for the film. That's a perfect world. That's not necessarily the world that we live in. I can't quite say that studios that work in a theatrically based industry always do that. In fact, I think we're finding the trend with these studios is that they're becoming more risk averse than streamers. And that's partially because they have one shot not that they have one shot, but they have, one shot to get one particular movie really going with people in theaters. And since less people are going to theaters and they want to watch those at home, what's tough is that to an extent, not that this is true, basically every time Marvel puts out a movie, it's a huge success. But now more often than not, as I mentioned, in post World War II, people in theaters are I think studios are experiencing flops or just really kind of down the middle, kind of forgetful films. They're experiencing so much of those. And so when let's say Netflix puts out a pretty mediocre film, they don't get dinged at all. They're still constantly going to, they just have, it's a drop in the bucket for them. And just how studios have progressed, they don't quite normally feel that way. I think that's why you actually see, what studios do have, as we mentioned before, is years and years and decades of IP that they can fall back on. And we actually find that studios, whether this is the right move or not, feel like it's the most risk averse move to return to their IP and make lots of remakes. Universal, for example, has a huge horror library, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, you know, all that Dracula, all that good stuff, and they're constantly the Wolfman, and they're trying to constantly do remakes of that. Fox pulls from their own as well. So again, maybe they bring on independent filmmakers for that. I also think that the push for more diverse filmmakers hopefully will help them with that for sure. It's not going to be an overnight change. Hollywood doesn't work like that, unfortunately, but that is what it should be, and only time will tell. But it is, I think, you know, I think studios feel like they have a lot more to lose a lot faster because they're already starting to lose it. So they definitely make their decisions from there. Since there are not as many theaters that people are going to, it'll probably already suffer just from that. It's very difficult to make a good sequel. There's a history of that. So the question of, is this going to be better than the original film? That's a little bit unlikely. And what's also really tough, we were talking, it's a little bit going back to, you know, receiving feedback on your work and things like that. Back in the old days when there was no social media, you would maybe read a couple of reviews in the newspaper, maybe hear something on the radio, if at all, and like that would be it. And there just wouldn't be as, you know, many people talking about a film, whether they like it or not. Now, pretty much film, like the future of a film was more or less decided on Thursday night, Friday morning, when people go to those initial showings, and then they get on Twitter and they either hype it up or they totally tear it down. So obviously there's that in the mix. But what's interesting, you're talking specifically about a Sony film. I think Sony attempted to do some kind of online streaming platform. If I remember correctly, I think it was Crackle, which was kind of a disaster. So what Sony probably is a little bit spooked by that. Maybe they'll eventually go back to sort of a Sony exclusive streaming service. But I think in the past 6 months, Sony has actually put together an incredible licensing deal with Netflix. So once Sony completes their exclusive theatrical windows for their titles, they can then send them along to Netflix to go onto their platform. So they're trying to achieve the best of both worlds and what they think is possible. So it's very likely, especially right now where we are with COVID, that Escape Room 2 won't see a ton of great box office numbers, but once it goes onto Netflix, maybe that's when everyone's going to watch it. And frankly, it's a sequel. Sometimes people feel like it's less necessary to go watch the sequel in theaters, and they're already going to watch it from the comfort of their own home, whether they're renting it or if they're watching it through Netflix.
Yeah. How can people from like smaller territories like Africa access streaming? Like, how do you get to pitch to the streamers or the studios?
There are certainly many. Almost every media company has a kind of an incubator, either for diverse talent or for women or for just filmmakers generally, that they make some measure of an investment in, and then try to basically assign. In television, they'll often assign directors to shadow directors. They'll sometimes give them episodes on shows that they produce, and that can be a launch pad. You know, I think, and there's like 1,000 ways to get to a career in this business, but you know, your local market is also probably the most readily available to you in terms of you know, how one can make a show or a film in South Africa that gets a certain amount of attention there, and then can kind of render you eligible for those programs. And you know, they oftentimes will relocate you to wherever the program is taking place if they think there's, you know, merit to the work. And film festivals continue to be one of the best launching pads to that stuff. But yeah, I think it'd be looking into what programs might exist that are internationally based to see. But that jump is like, and it can take like a decade. It can take 15 years. You know, your careers will hopefully be very long. And as you continue to ascend, new opportunities will avail themselves to you, and hopefully you'll find yourself in your 40s or 50s working globally. But you know, I wish there was a more straightforward path to that.
All of the gatekeepers, all of the touch points to studios and streamers, like they're all humans, right? So it's like, and it's a big part of the game is like creating that human connection. And you know, like, I don't want to turn this into like a networking kind of digression, but it's the thing to think about. And and as you know, like in some of the past conversations, we're talking about finding that support group or finding that group of people that will give you honest and helpful and constructive feedback about your work. It's also finding the people that believe in you and can champion you and helping each other out. And I mean, I feel like there's so many ways in which we're getting incoming materials or opportunities to be evaluating something or looking at something. And at a certain point, there's just too much coming in for us to handle. So I fall back on, you know, the way that I feel about the humans and the taste of the people at the agency level, or also other people that I know that are coming up and then have a friend and will vouch for that person. Like, so it's like, I feel like that's happening at every level. And you know, Sam and I are still kind of in the middle of our kind of like our pitching presentation that'll be the next session. But like, it's like, it is something just to keep in mind that all of these avenues are controlled and maintained by other humans.
And by the way, people like your relationships with people who are assistants and PAs today are going to be relationships with the people who are producers and studio executives tomorrow. Like, you know, as you come into a business, and I'm putting age aside, I'm not talking about age, but more just experience. It's like those people who are all the people who are starting out now, in 5 years are going to be here, in 10 years are going to be here, and a rising tide lifts all boats, right? You know, that the people who I was an assistant with at CAA are now writing Marvel movies, right? Or they're people I can hire as a producer to direct a movie. You know, we all came up, we all had no power, no access when we started, but as one person succeeded, they said, hey, come along with me. I'll you know, introduce you to this person, and I know someone who can fund your movie. And so it's like that sense of community, even if you're starting at like college, like when I went to college, the people I went to college are a lot of the people I still have professional relationships with. I won't say how long ago that was, but yeah, so it's like, to Clayton's point, all those human connections and all that networking and getting to know your own peer group, forget the people up here, but your own peer group who, you know, y'all can access easily and go out, have a meal, have a beer, whatever. They all kind of, y'all come up together and you'll be able to help one another out. So what seems unattainable now, you know, your best buddy might be getting there in 3 years and kind of bring you along. Like that's part of it. And I mean, and a really gratifying, fun part of it, because you're like, sometimes you'll turn to each other and go, holy crap, it's been 10 years, it's been 15 years. Like, look, we're sitting at a premiere of our movie. Like, what, you know? So it can be really cool that way.
I think it's the same point Abby made earlier, but you know, giving is living.
Yeah.
Yep.
And being generous with the advantages that you have, and other people being generous with the advantages they have, and working as a team. Again, it's like one person's success can be another person's success, can be another. I mean, you can really build off of it. I mean, obviously it's a competitive business, and people are very, you know, can be very territorial and possessive about their own relationships. But there's like enough money and success to go around. Like, you don't have to hoard it. Like, everyone can truly, like, that is how people, you know, writers will be friends with each other. They get a show, they need a staff writer. That's who they recommend, right? You know, it's like,
build bridges, don't burn them. I hear
there you go.
Yes.
And you never know, because the person who might be the assistant or the PA could end up running the studio, and you don't know who those people are, and you should never write anyone off. I mean, there are people who there are many examples of people who have had assistants who then become their boss. Like, it happens all day long. So it's something to be, you know, something to be aware of. And it's also like better to be a nice person going through the world than not.
So with all of these, like, you know, platforms popping up, like where is it going? Is it eventually going to get to the point where we're like, actually, it would be great to just have a one-stop shop?
What you just predicted, right? The idea that, like, are we just going to want to go back to one place that has all these things?
Yeah,
I think so, because, like, I mean, it's becoming rapidly unaffordable, like, for the regular person to carry all these subscriptions, right? And it's like, so I imagine there will be some measure of consolidation yet again. I don't know that may mean a lot of people lose jobs and the business contracts and content gets more, we make less of it. I don't know, but it seems to me to be somewhat unsustainable to continue to add more and more of these streaming services to one's budget, like household budget. Like it's a big ask to carry all of these things. So but someone on Wall Street probably knows the answer, or Silicon Valley.
It's funny even though streaming has a very young history, what's consistent about history is that it usually repeats itself. So let's see.
There'll probably be bundlers again, like what happened with cable. People bundled different channels. So you'll just have somebody come along and bundle all the streaming networks. Whether that's a distributor,
Apple.
Roku,
It'll be Apple.
It'll be Apple, right? Disney kind of attempts
They
to
have the
do
most
that
money.
with the companies they have stake in. Like at Disney, you can get Hulu, ESPN, HBO Max, and I don't know,
Geo
probably something else. Yeah,
and
Nat Geo, all for probably like 50, 60, but I don't actually do that. I think I get some of them individually, which is probably a mistake, but they already kind of do that, and somebody's just going to come probably do that on a bigger level.
I think also our DSTV, our sort of South African cable equivalent, is sort of beginning that bundling thing, because now they have this thing of you can sort of have Netflix and Showmax, which are streamers, involved in your actual monthly package. So that's also, I think, something in terms of trends. I'm wondering, just when you guys are approaching streamers, whether it's Amazon Prime or whatever, is there sort of a trend that they say, well, you know what, we're actually looking more for TV series as opposed to films, because TV series perhaps keep people sitting down and watching more than just the film? Have you guys noticed that trend, and which one is perhaps more preferred by the streamers now?
I don't know if it's necessarily whether it's just film or TV, but it's the kinds of film and the kinds of TV. So it's funny that you mentioned Yes Day, because Yes Day is going to get a sequel because it had 63 million households watch. I mean, I did not watch Yes Day. That's not my kind of film.
I was forced to watch it by my nieces.
It's definitely for it's a family event film. Yeah. Completely get that. So I think it had 63 million household views in its first 28, 30 days. I think that's how they usually try. At least that's the information they usually reveal. It's about in the first month. Sometimes I think for television shows, it's like in the first couple of months or 4 months, something like that. So to them, that hit a number that they felt like warranted a sequel, that enough people would probably turn on a sequel. I remember that happening. And this came out a couple of years ago, but for Bird Box, that hit like a certain threshold for a number of people watching it at home on the platform. And so that triggered their need to want to create a sequel. And I think like they're definitely not that it's not so much about whether something gets a sequel or something doesn't get a sequel, but if a certain kind of film, if they put out let's say they put out 5 sci-fi films and they just like don't really do that well, maybe they're going to feel less inclined to go for that kind of sci-fi film in the future.
Yeah, they have a lot of data. I mean, I think what there's something interesting that is just fun to share with you guys anecdotally that I find really interesting about making television for the streamers. But to your point about how long people stay tuned in, something that we are often reminded by our streaming partners is, that you lose your audience in like 5 minutes. And so a lot of and this directly impacts you guys as creators, because you're going to have to service this. But there is this idea of like something crazy has to happen in the first 5 minutes. Something so, either character, something so wild or something so big and spectacle-like, but basically the burden is like, you better get people to stay with this show right off the bat, because that's when the remote's still in their hand and that's where they're going to be the most judgmental. So this idea of a slow burn beginning, we'll just kind of draw people in and they'll be intrigued. You got to like grab them right away. And so I do think that viewing habits and the way they're able to actually tell at what minute somebody decides they're not interested anymore definitely finds its way back to the notes you will get from those buyers about, we need this by this minute, we need this by this minute, we need this kind of, so, there are absolutely ways they use all of that very specific data to then retroactively tell creators, okay, we know that these viewers behave this way, and so we need to service that behavior very specifically in story and content. And I find that kind of interesting.
I think what's also really interesting is this whole notion of the zeitgeist, the Steinerian concept of relative numbers converging on the same point together, but independently. The
That's
spirit
social
of the
media.
age. Yeah. Because I just think back to, again, sorry to go back to Forrest Gump, but the whole idea that Rain Man preceded it. Paramount almost wanted to close them down because they'd had an idiot savant, winning an Oscar just before, kind of thing. So they thought, hey, no, we can't carry on making this movie. So it's fascinating how history kind of like.
Well, and people come up with the same
well.
idea at the same time. You'll notice that, like, you'll have an idea and then you'll see a TV show with that same idea and you'll be like, huh? I thought, or like there'll be two competing versions of the same story that are racing to get to be filmed. They just did it with Tiger King. Peacock had a Tiger King adaptation based on that documentary that Netflix did, and Amazon had a Tiger King as well. And Peacock made it to screen faster, and Amazon's Tiger King had to basically fall apart. But yeah, you'll see a lot of that in our business where the same ideas are kind of happening amongst lots of different parties. And no one's ripping anyone off. It's just kind of what's in the zeitgeist, I guess.
My favorite, it's not necessarily an anecdote, but my favorite example of that, because it's so crazy, were these two rom-coms, No Strings Attached and Friends with Benefits, came out, I swear to God, within 6 months of each other. Yeah, Bongi's shaking her head because she knows, because we love rom-coms. But No Strings Attached was with Ashton Kutcher and Natalie Portman, and Friends with Benefits was with Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis. Basically the same movies with different named actors about people who who are friends, and they start out, they have sex thinking that it's not going to lead to any feelings, and naturally it leads to feelings and them ending up together in a relationship. It was hilarious that they came out in the same time. I don't remember which one came out first and which one was more successful. They were probably both pretty baseline, but somebody thought that was okay to do, and they weren't concerned about it.
It was really, really fantastic, actually, just to get the overall overview and just to feel updated again in terms of what's happening. And kind of how that structure works, because it has changed so much. And I feel like COVID has just grounded that and made it kind of fixed and taken it to a mature space as opposed to an emerging space, that change.
I think that's so right. I think COVID has really put a magnifying glass on sort of what is here to stay. I mean, it's so tough. It's kind of heartbreaking, at least from my perspective, of what's here to stay and what's possibly, dispensable and expendable. And I would hate to, I grew up going to the movie theaters. For me, everybody has a different sort of measurement of what success is. But I always thought to myself, oh my gosh, a movie that I've worked on being in a movie theater, that feels like such success. Even if it doesn't make any money, it's like, that feels like such success to me. And I would hate for that practice to go away. It's not going to go away overnight. I think especially in really big movie watching meccas like Los Angeles and New York, I don't know what it's going to be like, for example, in Middle America, much less outside of the United States. But, it's such a beautiful cultural thing. I actually also think what people aren't talking about is if you get rid of movies, there's a pretty big shock to the food system, to the food industry, if you get rid of that, because people always associate movie with a meal afterwards or before or whatever that is. So they're going to do what they have to do to make it work. That's kind of my view. But yeah, I think basically as long as smartphones are around and it doesn't seem like they're going anywhere, a lot of people are going to be watching from the comfort of their own home. And I do it a ton. So don't feel guilty for doing so. That's what I'd say. But we'll see. Crazier things have happened. Nobody expected a pandemic. Who knows what's going on.
Thank you, everybody, so much. We really, really appreciate your time and your effort and everything you put in. And we'll chat next week. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks all. Have a good rest of your week.
Cheers, then.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.